Welcome to Oriental Journeys Podcast, a podcast inspired by the travels and writing of the legendary traveler Ibn Battuta. My name is Ray Behboudi, your host today. This podcast is produced in partnership with Monash University. Ibn Battuta, one of the most noted explorers of the medieval world, narrated a series of first-hand observations on the destinations he reached over almost 30 years of travels in 14th century. This Moroccan traveler passed through an astonishing extent of places, encountering diverse people. His observations, experiences, and encounters tell us a lot about what life was like in medieval time, with fascinating relevance to now. Guided and inspired by Ibn Battuta's footsteps, this podcast opens a portal into the world of the East for people who are curious about the past, hungry for the marvels of traveling, and contemplate the wonders of cities. Accompany us over our journeys into the distant, unfamiliar, and unknown. In this episode, we sit on another online conversation to explore Ibn Battuta's traveling and search to find out more about him and his travels with Tim Mackintosh-Smith. Tim is a British Oxford-educated Arabist, writer, traveler, translator and lecturer, based in Yemen for many decades but currently nomadic. He is one of the foremost scholars of the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta. Mackintosh-Smith has published a trilogy recounting his journeys in the footnotes of Ibn Battuta, Travels with A Tangerine, The Hall of 1,000 Columns, and Landfalls. In 2007, Tim presented a major BBC documentary series, Travels with a Tangerine, recounting his experiences tracing Ibn Battuta's 14th-century travels in the present day. In 2016, he also published an edited abridgement of Travels of Ibn Battuta with Macmillan Collector's Library. Welcome, Tim, to this episode, and thank you for accepting the invite. In the last episode, we listened to the opening passage of the Travels of Ibn Battuta and touched upon the historic context and the value of the traveler as a historic source theme. Today, I would like to begin our conversation with asking a question on motivations of Ibn Battuta on taking this route. Ibn Battuta stepped into his journeys, which took almost 30 years, with the purpose of visiting the holy sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina. Once he completed these pilgrimages, what kept him moving for decades afterwards?
Well, I think like all of us, he had several motivations. In the sense he was traveling on several different roads at the same time. And at the most basic level, he was looking for jobs. And he knew that as somebody from the old Arab and Muslim world heading towards the new Muslim world, he could probably find jobs as a jurist, as a judge, as indeed he did. He was the supreme judge in Delhi for the Maliki school of Sunni Islam. He was the supreme judge in the Maldives, as I've said. So he did get these jobs, and he could sort of float around from court to court. And, rulers at that time who were Muslim, they were looking for legitimacy. And to have a kind of real Arab scholar, even if he was ethnically Berber, but to have a real Arab scholar like Ibn Battuta in your court was a sort of ornament to your court, and it kind of added to your legitimacy. So there was that aspect, and he could make a good living. And of course, plenty of people did this and never went home and never wrote the book. That's the important thing. He got home, he wrote the book. But that's one road that he was on, a sort of material road. But he was also on a spiritual road. He was, I think I've written somewhere that he lived in, you're too young to remember, but the age of Aquarius. The sort of hippie time, 60s and in the 70s. the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And it was a bit like that when he was around in terms of Sufism. And he was fascinated by this aspect. And he was a sort of, he wasn't a Sufi sheikh himself, but he was a kind of lay follower of Sufism, and he joined various Sufi orders. And he always made a point of looking out the Sufi sheikhs, the Sufi masters, wherever he went. So, in fact, very early on in his travels, when he got to Alexandria, he met this guy called Burhanuddin al-Araj, the lame, who was a Sufi sheikh. And he said, Burhanuddin said to him, "Oh, when you get to India, you will see my brother. When you get to Sindh, which is sort of Pakistan these days, you'll see my brother. When you get to China, you'll see my brother. And please say hello to them all." And he says something like, "Oh, I've never had the idea of far travel in my mind, but it was cast into me by these words." So there's that aspect. There's a material aspect. There's a spiritual aspect. There's an intellectual aspect. There's a famous saying of the Prophet Muhammad, which says in Arabic, "Go in search of knowledge, even takes you to China." And so there's this, this sort of boundless curiosity.
Tim, I think you cleverly classified the main motifs of Ibn Battuta for traveling. Just to sum up, can we say that his main drivers were searching for knowledge, getting jobs in the courts which were in the lookout for legitimacy, and his spiritual yearnings?
Well, and there were other strands to the court as well. But I think those are probably the main ones, the main three.
Now, being familiarized with Ibn Battuta's key motifs for traveling, I would like to immediately dive into one of his travels' focal points. We know that in Munyat, which is a city in Upper Egypt, Ibn Battuta spent a night in a holy man's hospice. He was called Murshidi. He described him as a man who was wearing a green cloak and black turban. In Arabic, Jubbatu Khazra wa Amamatu Suda. Ibn Battuta slept on the roof of the hospice where he had a strange dream, which changed his life entirely. You have visited Murshidi's hospice during your travels, where you have been wrapped up with a bunch of lovely local kids there. Can you tell us about both the dream and the tomb?
Yeah, it was, I mentioned this Burhanuddin in Alexandria being a Sufi influence on his travels, and really al-Murshidi was the other great influence also in Egypt, and not far from Alexandria in the Delta. And this dream that Ibn Battuta had, he said, "I dreamed that I was on the wing of a great bird, which flew with me to the east," and he mentions various countries, going to Central Asia and so on. But it flew far to the east, and he said it landed eventually in, I think Gibb translated as a dark and greenish country. And it left me there for a long time. And that was the dream. And he gets up the next morning and he speaks to a Murshidi. He tells him about the dream. And the Murshidi interprets the dream and says, "Oh, it means that you will go to visit these places and you will end up in India, which is the dark and greenish country." And then he adds on, he says, "When you get there, you will fall into great danger, but you will be saved by someone called Dilshad," which means in Farsi,
happy-hearted.
Happy heart, exactly. Dilshad. And al-Murshidi used the Farsi name, as I remember. And, all of this comes true. Ibn Battuta gets to India, and then on the course of his travels, he's captured by some rebels, and he escapes, and he's alone in the jungle, in the scrub, and dying of thirst. And eventually he bumps into this man who says to him, "Climb on my back, and I will save you." And he does, and he says, recite 1,000 times, "Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakeel." God is my sufficiency and the best of helpers, something like that. And he does, and he passes out. But before he does, he asks him his name. and he says, "Oh, my name is Al-Qalb al-Farih," which means Dilshad. So whether you believe things like this or not, it's a matter of faith. I do actually, because I know that things like this happen. Things like this have happened to me. I mean, not quite as dramatic as that, but it's all part of the pattern. And this place, Minyat al-Murshidi in Egypt, it is a strange place. I can only think of it, it's a bit like a sort of pool of water where a pebble was dropped and the ripples spread out. And they're kind of still spreading out. I mean, you mentioned those children that we encountered when we went and filmed there. I had an email from one of them just the other day, and he said, "Oh, do you remember me?" And I kind of wrote back and I said, "Well, I remember all the children." And he said, "My dad was the one who could remember Ibn Battuta's words by heart." And I said, "Yes, I do remember you." And that was, what was it? When were we there? 15, 16 years ago. So, the ripples are still spreading out across time.
Impressive analogy on likening Murshadi's tomes over time to poo and ripples. So his dreams and interpretation came through, and Ibn Battuta ended up exploring those dark and greenish lands. Let's now shed on some lights on Ibn Battuta and his personality. Being Ibn Battuta's companion for many years, how would you describe his personality, Tim, and what are some of the most distinctive traits in his character?
Well, I mean, obviously he's a complicated being a human, and a lot of the complication comes across in what he writes about himself, because, as I said at the beginning, he does paint a very full picture of himself, even if he doesn't always mean to. So, what can I single out from all his character traits? It's very difficult to say. I mean, I think one thing that always strikes me is the way that he's very open-minded. He's a very traditional Muslim. He's a faqih. He goes to the Maldives and he says, "Oh, there are these women walking around with nothing on their tops, and I tried to stop this, but they wouldn't." And he gets very worked up about this. And, he is very traditional, but he's also very open-minded. And I think he's very open-minded, particularly with outside the immediately Muslim community. So when he goes to Constantinople, he goes to a church service, or at least he's in the church, and he says he hears the boys singing and says, "Oh, it was the most beautiful thing that you could imagine." And also in Constantinople, he meets a monk who apparently had been the emperor, but had been deposed or had deposed himself and become a monk. And he talks to the monk, and the monk learns that Ibn Battuta has been to the Christian Holy Land, to Palestine, and been to Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And Ibn Battuta says, at that point, he took my hand and he touched my foot. And he says, I grasped the hand and touched the foot of one who has entered Al-Quds, Jerusalem. And Ibn Battuta says, and I was amazed at the faith of one like this, who, with me, though not of his faith, had such belief in these holy places through me. He was open to things like this, and there's another sort of touching point where in India he married somebody whose brother was the Sultan of Madurai in southeastern India, and it was at that time it was a Muslim state. He was fighting his Hindu neighbors, and he was committing atrocities. And Ibn Battuta is absolutely shocked by this. and says that he shouldn't be doing this. It's not part of our faith. That he was very much a human being. He saw the humanity in everyone, and I find this very, very touching. When he looks at himself, and this is another big aspect of his character, he does often try to paint himself as the great guy. And there's a lovely discovery, which I wish I had made, but somebody else made it. Dr. Abdulhadi Tazi, God bless his soul, who was the great Moroccan scholar of Battuta, and I would say a beloved friend. And he writes about the discovery in the library of Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo of a manuscript that was copied by Ibn Battuta while Ibn Battuta was a young student in Damascus. And he writes in his book, Ibn Battuta writes about a man he stayed with who was Moroccan. And probably as a sort of thank you present or something, he copied a manuscript for him, which still exists. And at the end of it, he signs it. He says, this was copied in the year such and such, and the month and the day, and I finished copying it on the day such and such. It was done by me, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Abdullah, etc., of the Tanjil Luwati, known as Ibn Battuta. And it's sort of, the signature suddenly becomes very, very big and flowery. And you can see, I mean, I'm not a handwriting expert, but ego, yeah.
Ego.
I think he was a very attractive man, fun to meet. He had a big head, and he also had a big heart.
You brilliantly articulated some of the major facets of Ibn Battuta personality in the examples you gave from the traveler team. Thank you very much. In that sense, we can say that he was an attractive and fun to meet character simply, and he was carrying a big ego he could hardly hide. He also is a pretty likable guy, being well received almost in every court he has made his way into. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he also, he probably spoke his mind too much sometimes, and he fell out with people. That's quite clear. But generally, yeah, people loved having him around them. But I've just talked about how many two facets of his character, multifaceted, obviously, and you have to read his book to learn about him as a fully rounded person.
Definitely, and I cannot agree more. Reading the book is highly recommended for the ones who are interested in getting to know Ibn Battuta's attractive and multifaceted character. Here may be good to zoom out a little bit, team, and shift our focus from Ibn Battuta's personality to the route he has taken in his journeys over almost 30 years of traveling. When we visualize Ibn Battuta's journeys, the travel path seems so crooked and random. And we know that Ibn Battuta once said, never so far as possible to cover a second time any road. Can you tell us about the travel path Ibn Battuta took and why it seems like this, and what factors were influencing his next destination and his route overall?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The path does seem random, and I just remembered when we made that TV series back in 2007, we had a map. And you really do need a map to explain Ibn Battuta's travels, because they cover such a huge area. And on the map, we had a sort of line that extended, a moving line, a dot, showing where he got to. And, most travelers, you go from A to B or A to B to C, there's some sort of logic to it. But when we did that line for Ibn Battuta, it went kind of scribble, 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 all over the place. And it was like some kind of mad insect or some crazy spider or something running backwards and forwards across the map of effectively the world in those days, the known world, much of Eurasia and Africa. And yeah, it does really look quite random, that line of travel. And it's only when you sort of look into his mind and see what caused him to travel that it does begin to have a sort of logic. And don't forget, he was always in search of something. And I was trying to think how to put it neatly, and it really boils down to partly to three S's: sultans, slave girls, that's a bit unfair maybe, and Sufi sheikhs. So, he went from sultan to sultan, he went from court to court, and this is partly because he needed to make a living. We might talk about this later. And partly because he was a sort of what you would call a kind of social climber. He liked moving in high circles, but he also liked the softer side of life, and being presented with slave girls and furs and money and so on. So he was always on the lookout for all possible ways of making a living. But then again, there was this very unworldly side to him, which perhaps kind of fought against his worldly or materialistic side, and that was his spiritual search. And we find him going out of his way to visit Sufi sheikhs and sort of particularly famous gurus, you might say, Islamic gurus, if you can use that phrase. So, I mean, there's one point where he's in Bengal, what's now Bangladesh, and he really goes out of his way to visit a particular Sufi master up there, and many other occasions. So, that actually probably that last part, what you can call a sort of the mystical map of his journeys, that is what gives it its own logic. And don't forget the absolutely seminal meetings he had with those two Sufi supremos in Egypt, Murshidi in the Delta, and Burhanuddin in Alexandria. And Burhanuddin saying, when you get to Sindh, Pakistan, say hello to my brother so-and-so. When you get to India, say hello to my brother so-and-so. When you get to China, say hello to my brother so-and-so. And Ibn Battuta saying, I never rested until I had met these three people. Again, the dream that we talked about when he was on the back of the bird in al-Murshidi's hospice in the Nile Delta. And al-Murshidi said, you will go to India, you will spend a long time there. Now, it's sort of more difficult for us today, people pretending to be rational and scientific and modern and everything, to credit this. But in Ibn Battuta's mind, it was these meetings that really laid down the map of his travels. So it's this kind of overlay, if you like, of material and spiritual. If you think of two kind of transparent maps on top of one another, the material, the spiritual, and you put them together and it all looks crazy. But in fact, for somebody who was pulled two ways, or more than two ways, like Battuta, that was his kind of mental map of his journeys.
Great insight. So, as I understand, aside from the significant influence of the two sheikhs you mentioned on Ibn Battuta's travel route, his path was also extensively guided by his search for three key things, which are sultans, slave girls, and Sufis.
And don't forget the whole idea of tawakkul ala Allah, putting your trust in God. It was that was actually directing his step. He didn't, in a sense, he didn't need an itinerary. The itinerary came from God and the way that God directed his own will on earth.
Which under modern context can be unusual traveling style. People often spend massive time to plan ahead their journeys, as opposed to Ibn Battuta, who most of the time had no concrete itinerary up front.
Yeah, if I can put it this way, he was quite a sort of '60s person, a bit of in a way, a bit of a hippie, because he sort of went with the flow. And, I absolutely love it myself. I wish I could do it myself now. When I followed him on my journeys, I was having to plan things, but I was always wishing that I had the odd 29 years or whatever he spent traveling and could just let myself go. It's more difficult these days, of course, and it's always it's the discoveries that you do not expect to make, which are the most important. Really, most of the sort of exciting bits to me of my own travels, and perhaps the most interesting bits of my books, traveling with Ibn Battuta, have been discoveries that were not planned. I think I put it this way at one point, that sometimes you can't look for something, you can only find it.
I should say very well said. Tim, I'm curious to know how the travel path of the BBC documentary you presented worked. Were you and the production team following the exact Ibn Battuta's path, or how were you selecting your footage destinations?
Yeah, no, TV has its own logic, and the logic of television is very different from the logic of writing books, because some things work on the screen, which don't actually work on the page. So it was kind of rather directed to make that TV series by what would work on the TV screen. So I mean, just to give one example, he talks about sailing down the coast of India, and they had these black guys as guards on the boats, who were the sort of the sultanic guard in charge. They were like Marines, if you like. And amazingly enough, their descendants are still there down the western coast of India. We visited some of them. And partly because they're just so interested, you meet these kind of Indianized people who are, ethnically, obviously, originally from sub-Saharan Africa. So, in a sense, that's quite exciting. But they were incredibly welcoming, and they had all these sort of amazing ceremonies, like throwing coconuts in the air and breaking them on their heads and that kind of thing, which really worked well for TV. Whereas something like, visiting a museum and seeing a very, very important artifact that has a bearing on Ibn Battuta's travels, that doesn't really work so well on TV. So, what to me as a writer would be important, we cut a lot of that out, and we sort of rejig things with what would be visually exciting. And, sometimes they come together.
Just can you give us an example, Tim, on the accounts that they have come together?
Ibn Battuta talks about when he's in Guangzhou in China. He talks about a strange sort of Sufi guru type person whom he realizes he had met in India or on a little island off the west coast of India. He meets him again in China outside Guangzhou. And the guy's living in a cave up a mountain. And one of the things we did for the TV show is we set off to look for the cave. And, we found it, or at least we found a very plausible candidate for the cave. And on the way, climbing White Cloud Mountain, this sort of extraordinary mountain that overlooks Guangzhou, we bumped into all these strange people. There was somebody teaching kung fu and lunging around with a lance. I met a gardener who could read all the ancient inscriptions, and I played kind of kick badminton. I'm not sure what they call it. It's a strange game they played in China. And I met on the way up all these people, and each one of them kind of directed me a bit further. And eventually we found this cave. At least I like to think it was the cave where Ibn Battuta met his guru. And that worked so well on TV, because it was its own little journey meeting these fascinating characters. And that was kind of unplanned. That was a tawakkul ala Allah.
You walked us through two amazing side-by-side journeys today. On one side, Ibn Battuta's travels, and on the other side, your exceptional experiences following his footsteps. I'm very hopeful we can set up another conversation with you to talk about social and cultural indications of the traveler. Thank you, Tim, for being our guest today, and thank you everyone for listening to Oriental Journeys. Our editor and creative consultant is Kate O'Connell. Aydogan Kars and Ashkan Bahrani are our content advisors from Monash University. Frank Joachim reads the passages from the Travels of Ibn Battuta. The reading passages are selected from the English translation of Rihla, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, translated by Hamilton Gibb, published by Hakluyt Society. The music was composed by Ali Koygin, and Hamid Mohebbi is our sound engineer.